Hello.
Good morning, Dr. Dunn. Are you ready? Can you hear us?
I can. It's a little bit of an echo, but I'm fine.
All right. Doctor, we are beginning our hearing in Fairfield. The board is here. We're ready to begin. And I want to call you as our first witness. And I would ask you first if you would state your credentials, please, sir, for the board.
My name is John Dale Dunn. I live in the middle of Texas. I'm a physician for 44 years and an attorney for 36 years, approximately. And I'm currently on the faculty at Fort Hood, Texas, at the Army Base Hospital called Carl R. Darnell Army Medical Center. I teach emergency medicine there. For the last 25 years, I've been a scholar and a student of environmental law and environmental policy as it relates to air pollution and water pollution in particular, but in general, also the scientific inquiries that are related to establishing policy. Those two areas of inquiry are toxicology, which is the study of poisons, and epidemiology, which is the study of populations. And we're going to talk about those things today. I could tell you more, but probably it's best for us to just go ahead and get going.
Doctor, we have your complete curriculum vitae, which we will give in the record. I would like for you, please, if you would this morning, to begin by telling us how you first became acquainted and associated with Dr. James Instrom.
I started teaching environmental law in the local college at the request of the Dean of Arts and Sciences in the early 1990s. And so during the 90s, I became interested in the Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. agency that's in charge of assessing environmental concerns and proposing regulations to reduce the harm that might come to the people of the United States or to the environment. During the 1990s, I became increasingly concerned about EPA activities, particularly since as a physician, I saw that some of the science that they were claiming established their responsibility to create regulations was not very good science at all. In fact, in some cases, it was nothing more than a sham, an effort to scare the public, and an effort to improve the status of the EPA as a savior to the United States citizens from what they were claiming was dangerous and harmful air pollution, water pollution, and other forms of environmental dangers. In the mid-1990s, I proposed as submissions to the Environmental Protection Agency that they should do something about the fact that the science that they were pursuing was not very good. The science that they were sponsoring as well as funding and citing. In the mid-2000, around 2004, I published a paper for the American Council on Science and Health that criticized the EPA. And it criticized particularly the chairman of their Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, who had published an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is a prominent medical journal in the United States, on air pollution, and a study that he did of 20 cities in the United States. My criticisms were multiple, and in fact, you have the two papers that I wrote for the American Council on Science and Health that were published at that website. And James Instrom was on the board of directors of the American Council on Science and Health. The American Council on Science and Health is headquartered in New York City, and for about 20 or 25 years they have been involved in trying to make sure that there's integrity in science as it relates to public policy matters. They have about 250 or 300 scientists on their board of advisors. The board of directors is another group that is composed of scientists, and James Enstrom was on that board of directors, so he read my paper that was at the website of the American Council on Science and Health and called me. He said that he was involved in an effort to resist the California Air Resources Board activities as they related to regulating diesel engines and diesel emissions. He gave me a little background on it, and he said that he had done an extensive paper studying a cohort of people that he had been following as an epidemiologist at the University of California, Los Angeles, in coordination with the American Cancer Society for a number of years. And so by the time he did his study, which was published around that time, this cohort of people, all of them Californians, had been followed for about 20 years. James Enstrom at that time had been an epidemiologist and a researcher at the University of California, Los Angeles for about 30 years. And the history that I got on him was that he had formerly been a nuclear scientist, a physicist in particle physics, and he got his PhD at the University, Stanford University, where they have a linear accelerator that allows physicists to do nuclear studies. I asked him why he got into epidemiology, and he said that that he wanted to do something that had to do with human welfare, and theoretical physics was not close enough to what he wanted to do. So he went to UCLA, got a postdoctoral fellowship in public health with a specialty in epidemiology, and after that he became an epidemiology researcher at the University of California, Los Angeles. This study that he had done on the cohort of American Cancer Society people is nothing more. When you talk about a cohort as an epidemiologist, you're really just talking about the group of people that you're studying. And he looked at these individuals that numbered almost 50,000 people to see whether air pollution was causing any harmful effects. And he didn't find any effect, and he published his study. And what he asked me to do was to help him with the battle that he was engaged in with the California Air Resources Board, which is a subdivision of the California Environmental Protection Agency. And he said that at that point that his study was being ignored, and of course the EPA, the US EPA, the California EPA they were pretending that his study didn't mean anything, even though he showed that air pollution in California wasn't killing anybody. We decided to start with the US EPA. So during the next couple of years, I worked with him on the various things that he was researching, and we decided in 2007 that we would go to the US EPA Board of Scientific Counselors, which is supposed to be an independent supervisory board for scientific integrity of the US EPA. And at that point, we added to our group of three a guy named Stan Young, who's a statistician and works at the National Institutes of Statistical Science, which is an independent research group in North Carolina. We asked the Board of Scientific Counselors of the EPA if we could make submissions that criticized what the EPA was using as science in air pollution. And Enstrom and I made presentations along with Stan Young. And in the case of this kind of a presentation, you're allowed 3 minutes. Mr. Grant has the submissions that we submitted in late 2007 and then again in early 2008, the first to the subcommittees of the Board of Scientific Counselors by me, Enstrom, and Young to the Human Health Effects Subcommittee. And then Stan Young went to another committee meeting in December of 2007 to make his presentation and arguments. The papers that we've submitted are the speeches essentially that we gave over the phone. I gave mine in person in Bethesda, Maryland in November of 2007. We submitted phone commentaries to the Executive Committee of the Board of Scientific Counselors in January of 2008. There's a man standing in front of my camera. All right, so we made our presentations, and one of the things that I found about this is the Board of Scientific Counselors is composed of all kinds of prominent scientists who work in the United States in various areas of public and private science. And they're supposed to be people who are going to give the EPA guidance on good science. The trouble is that members of that Board of Counselors are getting paid by the EPA to do research. I'm serious. These are people who in many cases have received hundreds of thousands of dollars in research grants from the EPA, and they're the ones that are supposed to be telling the EPA how to do good science. And in fact, I sat down with a doctor who's on this Board of Counselors. He was on the subcommittee, and I asked him, since he did air research, air pollution research, my camera is being moved, but I think I'm doing okay now. Is that you, Mr. Expert? Okay, so I talked to this doctor who was at the University of Rochester because Jim Enstrom knew him from the old days when they had shared some interests in regards to air pollution research and trying to improve the integrity of the air pollution research community. And I asked him about why it was that the EPA was doing their best to ignore what Jim Enstrom had done. And he had no excuse. But part of the reason he had no excuse is here's a guy who's making a lot of money with grants from the EPA, and he's sitting on a committee because he's been chosen as a wonderful person, and he is a good research scientist. He's a physician who's a pulmonologist and a critical care specialist, and so he's a high flyer, but he's not about to tell the EPA that they need to do something about the integrity of their science, and they also need to be more accepting of the research that may disprove some of their claims. I must tell you, I met him at noontime, and after we finished, I had no hopes for the Board of Scientific Counselors. Later that year, Enstrom and I were involved in some public meetings, and then we started a campaign to try to resist and challenge the EPA's new proposal, or the California EPA's new proposal for diesel regulations. And that's what this is all about. This is about diesel regulation because diesel emissions are considered to be a major source of small particulate air pollution. Small particulates are particles of things in the air that are in suspension that are in the range of 2.5 microns or less. Just to give you an idea, the diameter of a human hair is 10 microns. So we're talking about very small particles that are suspended in the air, and the claim that the EPA, U.S. EPA was making, as well as the California EPA, was that small particles were killing people. During the mid-1990s, the U.S. EPA claimed that small particles in ozone were killing 20,000 people. Just to get you an idea of how things have become exaggerated, the U.S. EPA is now claiming that small particles alone, because they kind of gave up on ozone, because ozone doesn't kill anybody anytime, they claim that small particles kill more than 300,000 people in the United States every year. Just to give you a comparison, there are 2.5 million people that die in the United States every year. 500,000 of them die from cancer. So what the US EPA is claiming, and what the California EPA does because it's riding along with the US EPA, they claim that small particles in the air, dust, are killing almost as many people as cancer. And they testified to that in Congress. Lisa Jackson was the executive director of the EPA, the administrator of the EPA, and in the year 2000, she testified before Congress, and Mr. Grant has the transcripts, that the impact of small particles in the United States was as much as the impact of cancer, and that controlling small particle air pollution would be the equivalent of finding a cure for cancer. We're gonna revisit that particular statement at a later point in this discussion. I fought with Jim Enstrom and a number of other people who are epidemiologists who agreed with me and agreed with Enstrom about the fact that the California EPA was putting up a lousy bit of regulation on the basis of lousy science. We fought that during the year 2008 and into 2011. And during that period of time, we found out that the lead author of the California Air Resources Board paper on small particles had a PhD that he bought for $1,000 out of a mail drop in called Thornhill University, which doesn't exist. It's just a place that makes PhD. Incidentally, he got honors in his PhD. I guess $750 will get you a PhD without honors, but $1,000 gets you honors. So we exposed this. We also exposed the fact that they were doing a lousy peer review. They had a board of science advisors to this paper, all prominent scientists. The trouble was, these individuals were not really engaged in doing peer review on the paper. What we found is that they weren't even getting our objections to the paper that was being used to justify the California Air Resources Board decision to create new regulations on small particles. What we found out was that they had been hired to sit as a scientific advisory group, and they had provided what looked like peer review on the paper. But then when we objected to some of the aspects of the paper, we found out that they were never asked to look at our objections. And you will, from Mr. Grant, receive an extended copy of all the complaints that we made. Mine started at page 129. Jim Enstrom starts about 11 pages later. And we outlined all the reasons why we said that this research is lousy. It's not any good. It's based upon epidemiology. It doesn't prove anything. You're just putting up numbers so that you can get people to agree to let you regulate diesel emissions, the evil diesel emissions, on the basis of small particle air pollution claims that between the mid-90s, when Carol Browner claimed that 20,000 people were involved in dying because of air pollution, by the mid-2000, the first decade of the 21st century, they were claiming hundreds of thousands of lives were at stake with regards to air pollution in the United States. And in California, of course, you had a proportionate percentage of people who, they said, were dying because of small particulates coming out of diesel engines. Understand this. They don't do research on small particles coming out of diesel engines. They have air monitors that do nothing more than screen the air for small particles. It could be that you shook out a feather duster and it created dust. That's going to be measured as small particle air pollution, in the place where the air monitor is. And all they did was compare air monitor information with deaths. They looked at death certificates. And if you eliminate deaths from trauma and deaths from cancer, everything else qualified as a death from small particles or air pollution of one kind or another, if they wanted to use it that way. Because most people die from cardiovascular deaths, right? You know, their heart stops. And a heart stopping was enough to be counted as a death from air pollution. Okay, so we'll talk about the air pollution thing, but the year 2008, 2009, 2010 were the years when we were fighting with the California Air Resources Board and all of their scientific army about the adequacy and reliability of their scientific research. They were so embarrassed by so many of the things that we found, including this $1,000 PhD, that they agreed to a debate. And there was a cage match held at Sacramento in February of 2010. Enstrom went, a guy named Sharice Mogavkar, who's a physician from the University of Washington who specializes in epidemiology, some other people like Fred Lipford, who's from the East Coast and has been involved in epidemiology a long time, Roger McClellan, who's from New Mexico and in fact was a chair of the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee for the US EPA during the mid-90s. And you might ask, well, what happened to him? Well, the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee told Carol Browner that she shouldn't be doing what she's claiming that she needs to do with regards to air pollution regulations because the science that she was using was inadequate and unreliable. Needless to say, the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee was reformulated at a very, very sudden and timely way so that from the late 90s until the present, the chair of the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee has been John Salmon, an enthusiastic supporter of all this research that I say is lousy. And Jim Enstrom will show that his research, even if you track it along and do it the way that they did it, his research doesn't show anything that they claim with regard to death. In the cage match that they had in Sacramento, it went so badly for the California Air Resources Board that their prize stallion, Dr. Michael Jarrett from the University of California, Berkeley, admitted, and it's on the video, admitted that he couldn't find any death effects in the research that he had done in California. And so you might say that they walked away without a very good showing, but that didn't stop them from pursuing their regulations and their new regulatory regime. At that point in time, Enstrom and all the rest of us were at a disadvantage because, as you know, agencies can do what they want to do a lot of times, and they can always come up with excuses, and they've got enough scientists working for them that they will always be able to put together a committee of people that have white coats in their closet who can say the science is clear. Air pollution kills people, kills hundreds of thousands in the United States every year. That's how I got involved. I made some visits to California, and I tried to stir up the folks to understand that the California Air Resources Board had done some bad research and was making some bad proposals for public policy. The California EPA was a party to that because they are, in fact, a supervisory agency that the California Air Resources Board is a subdivision of the California EPA. And I think that covers how I got involved with Jim Enstrom enough, doesn't it, Mr. Grant?
I believe it does, Doctor. One thing I would ask you to clarify is when you talked about the reports as to particulates causing premature death, can you tell us how those deaths are figured? How do they come up with their numbers?
Well, it's the simple way for folks to understand that are not epidemiologists is, epidemiology is a study of populations. And the way that the small particle air pollution research is done is that they follow and track air pollution monitors that are placed around the state, and they're present in almost all the counties of the state except for the very sparsely inhabited counties. Then what they do is they look at daily death certificate information. As you might imagine, there are a certain number of people that die every day. And if you average it out over a year, you might come up with a number. For example, for Sacramento, it might be 48 persons die average every day. This research is so bad that all they do is slice and dice the death certificates to see if they can find an association with a bump in air pollution. Now, you know as well as I do that from day to day in Sacramento, if the average number of people that die in Sacramento every day is 48, that probably some days it's going to be 59 and some days it'll be 32. If you look at those variations from day to day and you try to match them up with the air pollution information that you have, you might find, the computer might find for you a bump that occurs at a point that you have chosen on an arbitrary manner to determine whether air pollution is killing anybody. And here's what they have done. This is so preposterous that what they claim now is that small particles kill people acutely. I was going to do an experiment for you because I'm removed from your hearing room. I was going to light up a cigar. And I was going to smoke the cigar in front of you, and then you could watch to see whether I died from the small particle air pollution that I have breathed around me. Small particles in cigarette smoke inhaled by cigarette smokers are in excess of 1,000 micrograms per cubic meter. The safety level that the EPA has decided is 35. So, has anybody seen anybody take a puff on a cigarette and die? Here's the deal. If cigarettes kill you from lung cancer, it takes a number of years. We measure it in terms of pack years. How many years have you smoked a pack of cigarettes every day? And how much risk do you have of getting cancer? Okay, and then the cancer is going to kill you slowly. The same would be true of heart disease, lung disease, right? Okay, so here's what this research does. It watches, and I'm going to try and show if I can show how it works. Here's the way it works. So I got the deaths going up and down. I got the air pollution going up and down, and I try to get it to the point where I can show you on a lag time of 1 or 2 days, hey, looky here, air pollution goes up, then 2 days later, deaths go up. That's the death research that these people are doing. It's a joke. But you know what they do? They take the small death differences and they project it to the more than 300 million people that live in the United States. And that's how you get to hundreds of thousands of people die every year from the small particles in the air. Is that preposterous or what? It's incredible that they could do this sort of a thing, but they get away with it because we have scared the public so much about the quality of air that they're willing to believe almost anything. And when you talk to people, you have to remember, a lot of people say, well, you know, John, I've been to Los Angeles when the air was bad there, and there's got to be something that's going to hurt you if you know, it's stinky and it makes your eyes irritated. I tell the story that my dad, who was a doctor, I used to make my brother, who's now a general surgeon, doing quite well at the age of 60, well, 60, he's 70, 67, and me, and we worked in the barn. You think there was some small particles in that barn? And do I look okay? Am I all right? You know, the point is, small particles don't kill you in a way that we know is what we call biologically plausible. And here's the terrible thing. Not only are they doing this game with the numbers of deaths and the air pollution going up and down, then the finding small associations, and then you multiply it times 300 million people to come up with this idea that hundreds of thousands of people are dying every year. You're also doing it on the basis of the fact you don't know how small particles would be killing anybody anyway. And you don't know how much people are being exposed to small particles. Small particle monitors that they're using are outside. How many people in this room spend the majority of their time outside? Not very many. Construction guys, truckers, people who work outdoors, they're outdoors, but most of us work indoors. So, do they do monitoring of air quality indoors? Nope. They do an air monitor, and they sit it outside in Sacramento or wherever it might be, Fairfield. I'm sure they have a few in San Francisco. And they're looking at outside air pollution monitor information and comparing it to people who spend most of their time on the inside. Now, even if you're not a scientist, are you starting to get a feel for the fact that this is junk science? This is stuff that doesn't make any sense. How do they get away with this? They get away with it because people believe, well, you know, if the air doesn't look very good, it's got to be hurting you. And so you listen to people and you say, well, yeah, but does that mean it's going to kill you just because it smells? I grew up on a farm because my dad was a doctor, but he wanted to really be a farmer, and so when he had enough money to have a farm, he had a farm. Okay, so a half a mile to the east of us was a guy named John Gray, a very rich guy who had a feed yard, you know, where hundreds of cattle eat food. Okay, so when the wind came from the east, I'd have to say that I could smell some problems with the air. And what we say in Iowa, which is where I lived at the time, is that's a smell of making money, John. So if the air of Los Angeles is irritating to people, that doesn't necessarily mean it kills anybody. But it's one step towards making people think, well, you know, the Clean Air Act really should be something that cleans up the air, so I don't have to look at air that got a kind of a yellow look to it, or it smells a little bit bad. And that's how the EPA gets on the train, and they can regulate anything they want to because they're an agency of the government. So, if that's enough of an explanation for how the toxicology and the epidemiology are being misused, we'll leave it at that, Mr. Grant.
Thank you, sir. As you came to know Dr. Instrom and to study the EPA collections and then carb collections, you had an opportunity to discover that there were human experiments going on. Is that correct?
Yeah, here's the way it happened. I sure hope that my voice is coming through better to you, that your voice is coming through to mine. I feel like I'm in a big cathedral here.
Yours is coming fine,
and I probably should be in a cathedral, but not on the giving side, the receiving.
One thing I can tell all your people in the group, that it may be that my exposure to small particles in that barn caused my hearing. And so when Mr. Grant talks, I can't necessarily hear every word that he says, but I get the picture. What you're wondering about is, okay, what's about this human experiments? Okay, here's the great and unique, it's kind of a coincidence, but it's a wonderful coincidence that I think all of you will appreciate. In the fall of 2010, Lisa Jackson, who was the administrator of the EPA, testified to Congress with regards to the matters that I mentioned before, how small particles were killing hundreds of thousands of people every year in the United States, and that it was equivalent to the impact of cancer. Steve Malloy, who I work with at junkscience.com, and we're looking for bad science and science that's not in the public interest, and we like to find junk scientists and make fun of them. Okay, so he called me and he said, "Hey John, I saw this online medical journal published by the National Institutes of Health called Environmental Health Perspectives. And they focus on environmental research that has to do with the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, all the things that the EPA does. They publish their own journal. It's online, which means that you can access it by the internet, and I don't even know that they use hard paper. Environmental Health Perspectives is edited by a guy who's an employee of the National Institutes of Health. He's a PhD. They choose the research that they want to publish, and they published a story about a 54-year-old lady who was involved in an experimental project at the University of North Carolina School of Medicine. She's 54, she's overweight, she's got high blood pressure, she's got a family history of some heart disease, and in her pre-experimental evaluation, she had an EKG that showed premature atrial contractions. Premature atrial contractions are nothing more than a sign of irritability of the upper part of the heart. Then she was taken into an experimental chamber, and they pumped in small particles. And they said, "Just breathe this stuff and we'll see how you do." All right? So they gave her a level of small particles that's 10 times what they said is a safe level in the environment. 35 mites is the safe level in the environment according to the EPA, and they gave her around 300. And the 300 came from, they pumped in whatever it would be that would give the level of small particle air pollution that they needed. Steve likes to show a picture of a diesel truck up next to the building so that they can put the diesel in there. But I don't know what their source of small particle air pollution is, except the fact that they claimed it was the kind of small particle air pollution that they're trying to control. And you know that small particle air pollution to them means diesel emissions. At 40 minutes, she developed atrial fibrillation flutter. I'm looking out in this group, and I'm seeing a fair number of people with white and gray hair. And I'll bet you any amount of money that some of you have a friend or have yourself had atrial fibrillation. It's an irregularity, a rapid irregularity of the heart. And that's what she got. At 40 minutes, she went from sinus rhythm with occasional PACs, which is premature atrial contractions, to atrial fibrillation flutter. It doesn't matter that it's atrial fib flutter, because that's really just a rhythm thing that doctors care about. It's that she had an irregular heart rhythm. They took her out of the chamber. They watched her for a while. The thing didn't go away, and so they put her in the hospital. Then about 6 weeks later, she got better, and the next day she went home, and she was back in normal rhythm. About 6 weeks later, she went to see what are called electrophysiologists. They're cardiologists that look at the electrical circuits of the heart to see if there's a reason for the problem. And they found an abnormal electrical circuit in her heart, and they ablated it. They do that with laser, and it makes the electricity go in the right direction so that you don't get these irregularities of your heart. So, these EPA experimental researchers at the University of North Carolina said, "Holy cow, we've got ourselves a study, a case report that shows that exposing this lady to small particle air pollution causes a cardiac arrhythmia. This is a reportable event. Let's put it in the journal. Steve Malloy read this kind of just by accident. And when he called me and he said, I got this report, I said, are you kidding me? These are people who claim that small particles kill you suddenly, cause cancer, cause disease, and they're exposing some 54-year-old lady who thinks that she's just making a little extra money, being an experimental subject, to this terrible toxin that Lisa Jackson is saying is the equivalent of cancer. Okay? So, we decided to look into this, and we found out a lot. The EPA has been doing human experiments for 20 years. Excuse me. I'm sorry about this. And it won't happen again. I put the phone on open line. Anyway, so we decided to look into it. We asked the editor of the magazine to look into the experiment because we said it was unethical, immoral, against the law, and against federal regulations. They said, nah, there's no problem. We asked the deans of the medical school at the University of North Carolina to look into it. We also asked the Institutional Review Board, which is supposed to approve things as to whether they're ethical or not. And they said, well, you know, it looks like it's okay. Here's the problem. There is international and domestic law that prohibits me exposing you to anything that might harm you in an experiment. It's outlawed. It's been outlawed for a long time because we found out that there were times when doctors would do terrible experiments because they really didn't feel any restraints. They were just doing what they were told to do. And the Nazis were the worst example, but there were plenty of human experiments done in the United States that are scandalous. The Tuskegee experiments on black males in I think Alabama, they were told they were being treated and evaluated and followed, and they weren't told that they had syphilis and it could be treated. They just wanted to see what syphilis would do to somebody. Well, that's a kind of a curious thing that anybody would have the nerve to do that sort of thing. But the Nazis were probably the best example of doing inhumane experiments on people. And the Nuremberg trials, 20 doctors were convicted, some of them were executed, and the Nuremburg Code came out of the Nuremberg trials. And the code, the first item of the code, there's about 10 items in the code. The first item of the code says, you cannot do experiments on humans that might harm them. Period. They can't consent to it. They can't consent to it for their kids because you can't even ask them to do it. If you have reason to believe that what you're going to expose them to is going to harm them, and I don't mean kill them, harm them. If it's going to cause a disease, it's going to cause them to be sick, you cannot do it. Okay, so at the point where we were dealing with this, we're thinking, okay, maybe this is because, in fact, the EPA knows nobody's dying from air pollution. Could that be? Could it be that the government is not telling you the truth about the research on air pollution? I know that there are people in the audience who can't believe such a thing would happen, but I'm here to tell you that's what this is all about. Now, Mr. Grant has a declaration under penalty of perjury that was filed by EPA officials in response to a lawsuit that Steve Malloy and a guy from the American Traditions Institute and I
That's your net neutrality.
All right, I can hear you.
Thank you.
I can hear you. I can't see you.
We had it for a second.
Well, can I just talk so you don't have to sit around and wait for me to come back?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Did you hear that? Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
If you can hear this in the cathedral, go ahead, we can hear you.
You gotta hit your button. Tell him to hit his button.
Robert says you have to push the button. I don't know
For
whether that's,
video.
you have to push the what? You have to push a video button.
Here we go. We'll get him. They must have found out that we were listening. Oh, here we go. Well, he's probably trying to call at the same time as what it is.
Mr. Hearing Officer, would you like to take a short break while we do this?
Yeah, let's take a 10 minutes. No.
All right, here we go. Here we go.
Cancel that.
Actually, this ended up being a really good break for all the old men in the room that need to go out to John. Okay, so I think I was talking to you about the. I was talking to you about declarations under penalty of perjury. It's like an oath statement. If you make a declaration under penalty of perjury to a federal court, that is something that you have to tell the truth. So a guy named Robert Devlin, who was a research director for the EPA for 20 years before the episode in North Carolina, and who claimed to be the author of 150 papers and had been involved in human experiments for a long, long time, answered the question. He said in his declaration under penalty of perjury, well, epidemiology doesn't prove anything. It can't prove causation. And so we needed to do human experiments to see if we could get some evidence that would support our position that small particles hurt people. Does that get through to you?
Yeah.
This is a guy who, I mean, if you talk about a Perry Mason moment, here's a guy who works for the EPA. He's worked for him for 20 years. He's a PhD in epidemiology from a fine university, University of Virginia. And he says, we had to do the human experiments because our epidemiology doesn't prove anything. And that at the point where this experiment was reported in the Environmental Health Perspectives Journal, Lisa Jackson was testifying to Congress that 300,000+ people were dying every year from small particle air pollution. And the only evidence that they had were these epidemiological studies where they did the game with the air pollution monitor and the death certificates. So, You might say that I was shocked and amazed to think, first of all, that they didn't find themselves a good liar for a lawyer who could tell them how to get around the problem that they had. And here's Robert Devlin, and Mr. Grant has his declaration under penalty of perjury, along with another declaration by a doctor named Wayne Cascio. Wayne Cascio is a physician. Robert Devlin was a PhD epidemiologist. Wayne Cascio, the physician, is a guy with cardiology background who was there to take care of the medical needs of the subjects. And in his declaration, he works for the EPA too. And in his declaration, he said, 10 domestic medical schools are doing human experiments and 6 foreign medical schools. There's one more thing that Mr. Grant wants to make sure that I tell you about, and that is subsequently we have done our best to get the medical schools to admit to their perfidy and to stop these human experiments. Our lawsuit was dismissed because they said we didn't have any standing since we had not been injured ourselves personally by this human experimentation project at the University of North Carolina. But Freedom of Information Act requests that were sent to the University of Southern California and the University of California at Los Angeles indicated that they were doing human experiments and that in some cases the human experiments that they were doing were on children. Children 10 to 15. There's no way under the laws of the United States or international code that you can experiment on children in a way that might harm them. Their parents can't consent. You can't ask, therefore you can't do. And so, in effect, what you have in the state of California is an agency that's out of control and universities that, because of all the money that's being granted to them to do research, either by federal, by non-federal, and by state organizations, are willing to do research in environmental matters that will support the regulatory regimes that are proposed by state and federal agencies on air pollution, water pollution, and other sorts of environmental risks. I think that covers...
It does, Doctor.
That probably covers it pretty well, Mr. Grant.
I'd like to ask just a couple of questions to finish up here. You've studied the records, and I have too. My question is, EPA has the EPA secured federal dollars for their work and told the Congress in the request for those money that these particles are in fact deadly, so much so that the EPA has to conduct its program?
Well, you know, you sound like a bishop talking from the pulpit, gigantic church, but I get the picture. You want to know about the Lincoln Law?
That's right.
Okay. The False Claims Act. Everybody here probably was born after the Civil War. Anybody here that's Civil War? Okay, so during the Civil War, contractors and suppliers for the Union Army were discovered to be cheating. They were either short-changing the contracts or giving inferior products. Maybe they were selling sick mules. There were any number of ways that they could be taking federal money from the Union Army funds and not supplying what they promised. So an act was composed called the False Claims Act, and which has been called since then the Lincoln Law, and it creates penalties for people who cheat the government. The theory being that taxpayer money should be properly protected, and fraud on the government is fraud on the taxpayer. And in addition to the penalties that are a part of the law, there actually is another unique aspect to it, and it's called the QITAM, or Personal Individual Attorney General provisions. And what that means is that private citizens who are aware of cheating and fraud can in fact report. They can be involved in the litigation, and they can be a part of the recovery from someone who's been involved in fraud on the government. The QITAM provisions have some rules in them, and I'm not going to pretend to be a QITAM lawyer, but that's one of the things that's kind of interesting, and it's what a lot of people think of as being a law that was intended to protect whistleblowers. But the main reason for the Lincoln Law is to prevent fraud on the government. Now, let's assume that I'm putting up lousy research and getting millions of dollars for it. Anybody in the room not know what that means? Let's assume that universities take an overhead from all the grants, and that they supervise the members of their faculty that receive these grants to do this research. And let's give you one example. The University of California, Berkeley is a fine university, the home of many famous people. And there's a guy named Jarrett who does environmental research at the University of California, Berkeley. He was one of the guys that was in the CARB group defending against our group, which criticized their research. And he was the one that I told you admitted that he couldn't, in the research that he had recently done that was funded to the tune of $750,000, that he couldn't find any evidence of human effects. Well, he walked away from that meeting and that cage match knowing that he had kind of gotten his head handed to him by making that admission. So he went back to his desk and he redid the research. And he produced a paper that Mr. Grant has, Michael Jarrett. And the paper, as a long title, has to do with spatial temporal analysis of the effects of small particle air pollution. And it was what we call a modeling exercise. When you're involved in the epidemiology, you have big piles of data. And a modeling exercise is an effort to make sense out of the data. So, in a paper that he published, Dr. Jarrett, University of California, Berkeley, said, okay, I did 10 different models for data management of this pile of data that I've got. 9 models said there's no effect, but I got a model to show an effect. When you slice and dice data, you can find effects if you're looking for them. You can train your computer to find them. And here's a guy who's admitting that he found in one of the models that he did a small particle human effect. Let me take you to a time long ago when scientists were respected and they did things that you and I would say were admirable and of great import. There was a guy named Albert Einstein. And one of the things that he said in his commentaries on science and what he was doing and what he didn't do is, one experiment can disprove even the most elegant theory. James Enstrom is going to talk to you about his research that shows that the CARB is wrong. If Michael Jarrett had been honest, he would have said, I got 10 models and 9 of them say there ain't no effect, and one of them shows an effect. I'm not going to take the one model that I've managed to torture the data enough that I can support the CARB position and try to put it up as good science, when in fact I've got 9 models that don't show anything, and means I need to go back to the drawing boards and see whether there's any effect at all. That's the way science is. And the way it works is this: if you test the evidence and see whether it can be reproduced and see whether it means what you say it means, then you can say, I've got a pretty good research project here. It's got evidence that supports my hypothesis. I've tested it. I've made sure that I didn't screw up on trying to put it together. Instead, what we've got is a guy from the University of California, Berkeley, who says, I'll try another model and see if that'll work. I'll see if I can slice and dice the data so that I can support the people that sent me $750,000. That's the problem with research when you've got government funders. You think that the researchers that work for the EPA, that sit on the board of scientific counselors, that advise the EPA on various scientific matters, don't pay attention to where the money comes from, and that their universities don't realize that if they have a prominent position with the EPA and if they're considered favorably by the EPA, that means that the university and the faculty member are going to benefit. And that's the problem. It's too easy to get into the whorehouse. If you have enough money, even the most noble of people are likely to bend their integrity just a little bit, particularly if they need a little money and they want to make sure that their career is not interrupted and that they're going to continue to be considered in a favorable manner by people who have money and who can determine who's going to be important or not. You think that the US EPA doesn't decide who's important in the business of air pollution research? And let's imagine that I'm a 25-year-old, 30-year-old PhD. I want to be an air pollution researcher. And I've got a choice. I work for the people in the Jim Enstrom group who don't get any money, don't get any funding, don't get any favorable treatment. Or I can work for the people in the EPA or the CARB and know that I'm going to be treated well and I'm going to be respected and I'm going to get funding. And my wife says, you know, I expect you to do well, John, and I'd certainly like to move out of this little bitty house into something a little nicer. You think that doesn't make a difference? You sure does. Even if you're a scientist and you're told that you're supposed to be have integrity when you do your scientific inquiry, you can ignore some evidence that may make your case a little worse because you know that you need to come up with the right results, or else the EPA is going to say, we think we'll pass on you for next year's funding. The same with the California EPA. The same with the California Air Resources Board. Do you think the people that do the research that says, hey, you guys don't have a case, you shouldn't be regulating air pollution this way, you think they're getting any funding from these agencies, from these governmental entities? I don't think so. And I think that's enough said.
All right.
Go ahead, Mr. Grant.
No, that's what I was seeking. Dr. Dunn, in order to get on with Dr. Enstrom, I believe that we have gone through the things that I discussed with you to get on. We do have some papers that we will offer to the board as written evidence, and in closing argument I'll summarize what they are. We'll have a copy for each of you in the record. Papers backing up what you've said, Dr. Dunn. I want to thank you very much for...
Well, before you thank me, Mr. Grant, I want to make a comment to the group. Thank you, all of you, for coming and listening, and I know that you could do other things today, and I appreciate the fact that you've got an interest in this. The person that's going to come on after me not only was previously a nuclear scientist and a physicist, but he's a man of integrity, and he's been treated very badly by the University of California. And I've been involved in the battle that he had to wage because of the fact that they persecuted him and eventually ran him off. And he did manage to recover from their malicious efforts, but he's a humble guy, and he probably won't talk much about his personal situation very much. I can tell you this, though. He did the research, and he followed the evidence where it was, and he knew that when he did what he did, it was going to cause him a lot of pain, because he was not telling them what they wanted to hear. Now you're going to talk to somebody who actually follows the research, follows the evidence, and says what he sees, not what people want him to say. So I wish you a good day, and
Wait,
thanks for your request.
Dr. Enstrom's entitled to one of my books, I think, called Justice My Ass. And you being a lawyer for all those years, I think I'll send you one too, Doctor.
Well, I've had a great time talking to you folks, and I hope that you have a good day, and I know that you'll learn a lot. Well, the problem with listening to James Enstrom is he does talk on a high plane, so tell him to translate when he gets to the big word.
I'll do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.